Hello, everyone. We're honored today to have with us Ms. Holly McKay, and she's the author of the book Only Cry for the Living. And she's a journalist, and she's been around the world doing journalism. And we're bringing her on today to talk about what's going on over there in Ukraine and her insights and observations so that we could get many different sides of what we're hearing and seeing. So thank you very much for being here today, Holly. When was the last time you were in Ukraine?
I just got back a few days ago, so I've been pretty much there since January, and took a small break sort of in the middle in late February. But aside from that, I spent most of this year there, and we'll just have a few days off, and then heading back again probably at the end of this week.
Are you going to go back to Ukraine?
I think so, yeah.
Wow. And how did you get out? Did you have to go through Poland to get out, or could you fly
I
out?
did. It was honestly a nightmare. The getting out was probably the most challenging part, just because there was sort of a little bit of confusion over how the costs were going up for foreigners to kind of be able to get cars to drive, and being an independent journalist, you don't have sort of all the resources of a network or a large company. So I was a little bit concerned that if the train stopped running, how much the cost would be in trying to drive from Kiev all the way to Poland, which is a really significant drive. So I ended up kind of with all the refugees, just how other people get out, which was on the train. And it's about a 15-hour ride, and it was sort of very last minute for me. So I was a little bit ill prepared. I didn't have water or food or anything. So it was a long journey. And then I sort of got to Lviv at 3 a.m. in the morning, and then had to sort of sleep in the station and wait for daylight so that I could find a cab to then drive me a couple more hours to the border. So it was definitely a very, very exhausting process that a lot of people every single day have to go through.
Were there concerns about, on the escape route out that, you would be stopped by bombs or anything of that kind of nature?
I mean, I think generally that part of the country, as you sort of go down south and then west, is fairly untouched by the conflict that's obviously ravaging the east side of the country. There always is that concern, and certainly when I finally got to the border in Poland, there were air raid sirens happening then, and so we sort of had to sit there for an hour and kind of wait for those to dissipate so that we could cross. But generally, that area, while it has been hit on several occasions, it's generally considered to be significantly safer than certainly the east side and anywhere near Kiev right now.
Now, before you said you were there since January. Were you there in Ukraine before January, before this time?
I have visited once before, so I sort of had a little bit of a network there and friends from a few years ago, while I was actually doing some work in Russia, and then I went to Ukraine after that.
Your insights of what's going on in Ukraine.
I mean, I think it's really a devastating situation, and it's one of those situations where it really was an unprovoked war. There was no need for any of this suffering to happen. And as much as we sort of hear about these heroic tales of Ukraine now, a month into the conflict, being able to push Russia back, which I think nobody ever expected that they were able to do that, which they're really holding out, and in some cases even going on the offensive. But I think at the end of the day, there are no winners in this war, and Ukraine may or may not succeed in completely driving out Russian troops. But certainly, that isn't necessarily a victory or a win for them, because you can see so many of their cities have been flattened. So many lives have been lost, and businesses broken down. And it's a country now that revolves entirely around a war, and there is really no other life beyond that. And it's going to be incredibly difficult, I think, moving forward for Ukrainians to ever be able to really trust their Russian neighbors again. And so I think this is something that isn't going to be over in a matter of weeks or even months. This is something that is going to have huge ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world for a really long time to come. And it's just a really, really, really sad situation. And you see so many of the most vulnerable people in the world. So elderly, disabled, pets, children, that are just suffering hugely as a result of this, and living in bunkers and being rescued. And it's just, there's so many different layers of trauma. It's very hard to process at times.
In reading some of what you've written, you talked about for several days, one of the women had been asking the guarding Russians if they could return to their homes to collect some belongings and personal items, to which the soldiers refused. Finally, one snapped and said, if the woman asked again, they will take all the men from the bunker and line them up in the streets and proceed to shoot them randomly in an apparent game of Russian roulette.
And I was hearing these stories so often from people that were in areas that had come under Russian occupation. And I was very curious to try to understand what life was like living under the Russians very suddenly. And it seemed to be, there were a lot of common denominators. And one of them was that the first thing that the Russian soldiers would do often was that they would come to these homes. And mind you, these people have no electricity, no heat, no food, nothing. And the Russians would come and want to sort of do inventory on who was there. And then they would take their phones from them, and then, proceed to take their clothing and their food and just put them in an even a deeper place of misery. And then these tales of just sort of random shooting, somebody being on a balcony, having a cigarette and getting shot. Someone else told me about a neighbor of his who was trying to deliver bread to a neighboring village, and the Russians considered him an activist and shot him. And almost everybody that I talked to that tried to escape, even through these quote unquote humanitarian corridors, were being shot at by the Russians.